black storm coming. See the lightning strike. Black people rising.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and along with my Rafiki, Brother Derek Williams, we'd like to welcome you to another one of our unique discussions. For those of you who are new to the show, we're an African-centered talk show whose purpose is to correct errors where errors are found and to introduce facts where we find that so many people are working on fiction when it comes to who we are as people of African descent. And we also believe here at the Umoja Circle that through dialogue, true and truthful dialogue, that you can make a shift in your consciousness. And when you make a shift in the consciousness, then you make a shift in the world that you exist in, because the world takes shape in your mind. And on today's discussion, this is the third part of a four-part series that we were doing based on this book that we will put up there. I have a copy of it myself, and so does Derek. It's called Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, by a Pulitzer Prize winner, Isabel Wilkerson. Dr. Wilkerson is a tremendous storyteller. You know, like me or like Derek, she's not a historian, but she studies just like us, and that's the kind of models that I follow, okay? I'm not influenced by the system's way of teaching. I try to get our perspective from our ways of knowing, and that requires dealing with our people like J.A. Rogers and all these great, brilliant black authors and historians that came before us. And what I told Brother Derek Sunday that study is my form of meditation. What I do is I got in the habit when I prepare for these shows, I get the books that I want to represent on the show, and then I travel back in time. And what I mean is, I travel back in time by studying these books. And in that way, I talk to the ancestors. I think in the way we people of African descent got disconnected from. The African ways of knowing, the African ways of thinking is an ancient way. And we've been disconnected from it by what happened to us in this land of the free, so-called free, and the land of the brave. And we're talking about that. And Dr. Wilkerson said that the structure that you might be taught in schools from the time you were nursery school about this place being the land of the free is a mythology. And her book is about the actual system that we created, which is a caste system. And before Brother Williams and I go any further on this discussion, we would like to introduce you to a video. It's by the BBC, but you got, and you might say, well, what does English need to know? But you got to understand, from 1619 to 1776, 157 years, we were British citizens, or the white people who came to this land were under British law. And even though this video is going to show from the British establishment of the enslaved system, which was an economic system, and the justification for that horrible system is where racism came into being. But we'll talk about this on the flip side of this video. Just watch.
Racism emerges really in the 16th and 17th, particularly the 17th century. Europeans were enslaving and had for some centuries been enslaving people both of Africa and of the New World.
The history of racism in the Western world is broadly associated with slavery as the early form of colonialism. And it's in that context that something called race is created. which essentially means that certain people who are defined as non-Europeans find themselves ruled and governed by Europeans.
For people in America in the 17th and the 18th century, race was a fact of life. And I think that racism is something that comes out of that interaction of necessity. This isn't people cooking up racism in their laboratory or in their study and then going out into the world to apply it. In a sense, white people, and blacks and Indians, worked out their ideas of race in proximity with each other on the hoof.
The British don't become slave traders and slavers because they are racist. They become racist because they use slaves for great profit in the Americas and devise a set of attitudes towards black people that justifies what they've done. The real engine behind the slave system is economics. Africans are items of trade. They're things that are bought, that are sold, that are bequeathed, that are inherited. They're like other items of trade. And once you've got that established, both on the slave ships, of which there are thousands leaving British ports, and once you've got that established on the plantations, and once you've got that established as a basis for expanding British wealth, how can you argue that somehow or other the great inferiority of black people isn't built into fundamental cultural values of the British?
John Hawkins was perhaps the first English trader to actually kidnap slaves from Tagreen, which is a couple of miles from Freetown, and forcibly took slaves away from Sierra Leone. The sad thing is that this man was even made a knight. When we were in school, we read about Sir John Hawkins as if he was such a good person, he was such a righteous person, somebody who had contributed positively to, the creation of the British Empire. It was only much later that some of us learned with regret that, in fact, he was not only involved in the slave trade, but he actually captured, slaves.
He established places down the quay, down by Government Wharf, what we call Government Wharf now.
Over time, it became an industry, and a lot of English traders and a lot of Sierra Leonean rulers, particularly those along the coast, became heavily involved in the slave trade. And we have, for instance, several islands off the coast of Sierra Leone that were prominent slave trading posts, like Bonds Island, for instance, where there were English force, other European South force, even Americans were very heavily involved in the slave trade from Bonds Island.
We trader come for buy. The number there, in a group iron, the number we want, he take up. He put on this fire room, open, a banner, not sudara.
And of course, we know the way they were taken, captured, tied up, chained, and thrown into the ships.
So it was a very bad experience for the slaves from the moment they were captured up to the time they reached the so-called New World.
And then those who survived and did arrive, had to be put for sale. And then when they were bought, they had to undergo all kinds of indignities.
One great woman, it could cost 2 man price. Sometimes it work for you, not the garden. Not come back, it work for you, it born picking for you. Now for that, it pay 2 times for one great woman. When you both come collect tuna, go.
At a conservative estimate, over 11 million Africans were transported across the Atlantic. Manacled and packed together like animals, at least 2 million died during the infernal voyage known as the Middle Passage.
Slaves are seen as deracinated people, people who did not belong, who were natally alienated. That is, they had no rights of birth, and they're seen as people who had been torn from another society, but not socialized into the new one. So they were socially dead, so to speak. They were seen as people without honor, which is a degraded condition. The value of this for the master is that the master had absolute power over the slave, regardless of what the laws may say. They had rights of life and death.
A situation grows up where thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these black or dark-skinned people are being kept down without rights and kept at work night and day by a system of surveillance with whips and cutlasses. And of course, there is the fear that they will try and rise up, that they'll try to run away, and that when they do that, they're going to slaughter the masters and the overseers and their wives in their beds. And really that any white person will be seen as a potential enemy by the blacks. And so you get this mutual fear between the two groups, and this tends to consolidate racial feeling. And the only way to keep these slave societies even minimally secure was to arm all the white men, and even indeed some of the white women too.
So you're there in your plantation manor, you're there in your settler outpost. What are the natives doing? Sort of classic line, from these movies. The natives are restless. What's going on? Those drums in the background. There's the idea that these people are sort of getting together and they're going to invade us, they're going to attack us. And it's a kind of projection basically. In other words, you've invaded their countries, you've subordinated them.
Now, what did you think after seeing what you saw, Brother Williams? In that movie, in that video, it established that the structure that we are falsely told is a free structure came on the backs of people that look like us, kidnapped people.
Yes. I think the video does an excellent job in giving the contextual aspect of the system that we often forget about. Many people think of slavery as a moral sin, which it certainly was, but it was also an economic sin, and the Europeans saw it as an economic necessity.
That's how they started.
And so when we talk about so-called forced labor, free labor for them under the direction of a gun, you have to see the integral tie with the suppression of a people for a primary purpose of benefiting economically from that systemic order.
And in that video, it mentions something that you always bring up in the show because of your history as a social action expert and equal opportunity expert. Somebody who, this man did a lot of things in the military where he would go into organizations and try to train the predominantly white people in that organization of what it is and what racism is and how it interaction that causes the problems that exist to this day. And I remember you told me that there was a critical point in some of your discussions where when you asked one of the white participating in one of your programs, they always say that they would fear if we got equal opportunities in this country. And this is in the 20th and the 21st century. We're not talking about 1619 or the 1500s. They feared that we would do to them what they did to us. And you saw them say that in that video, that they were afraid of that they were not stupid. They knew that they had to keep an oppressive boot on the neck of those millions of Africans that you forced into horrendous labor, right, brother?
Yes. And while that was generally the response, I think, upon examination, you'll find that basic premise, that fear, still exists today.
You hear it today, yes.
Okay, and you don't necessarily have to have a critical ear anymore. People are quite free in, they're coming for our positions, they're coming for our jobs, and all of the things that you see that are done to push back and to restrict that aspect of equality confirms that is still a a fear, and not so much a hidden fear anymore. It's articulated.
Thanks to the Trump administration, he just opened the door, because we got to admit that since the 1964 Civil Rights Act, it went a little bit underground.
Yes.
Because there were certain laws that were put on the books that are being rolled back, I might say, now, that made it illegal to do the things that were natural for hundreds of years. We're talking about from 1619 to the 1776, which the people, we have this mythology of these great men who were, bringing new forms of liberty into the world and all that, but they were all slaveholders.
Yes.
They were all no different than what that video showed of the people who originally established this form of economic enslavement.
Yes, and they were consciously aware of the system that was in place.
Yeah, exactly.
And using words that were not really descriptive of reality.
The actual reality, exactly.
And hell, you see that in language today. What's written on the paper and what is in reality are sometimes a difference of night and day. But it speaks to their awareness and the effort and the attempt, a very successful attempt, to write that into the very document that was supposed to govern
the Constitution,
the
3/5
order
of a human being.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, you had to establish what Malcolm called an established order logic.
Yes.
And when he was talking about, he said the established order logic is the logic of the dominant group, or what we call the upper caste.
Yes.
You got to understand that when I started reading this book, it did something to the molecules of my mind. Okay, what I mean is you got to understand that we look at behaviors as a defining thing. When you see how people act on a video or what you see on the news always focus on behaviors. But that's a trick, because you got to go even deeper. Because it's not the behaviors that are the problems, it's the ideas that produce those behaviors that you got to focus on. And like you said, you're a systems man. You say that there's all kinds of connections to a system. And racism is not an individual thing, it's a group dynamic that is being manipulated in the media, where they always say that somebody that look like Brother Derek and myself could be racist. How can we be racist if we are not in the member of the caste that dominates this system, that could control the law? I could be prejudiced.
Yes.
You could be prejudiced.
Yes.
And we can't, they're trying to, fool us into believing that a prejudice statement is a racist statement. You hear that all the time. Are you racist? Because somebody said something that was pretty prejudiced. And prejudice means you just have a perception of things not based on any facts.
Yes.
But every human being has that.
And I think that's a very important point that you bring up, Smokey, because if you can take a system and individualize it, okay, you can distract the attention in examining the system.
Exactly.
It's like the law of universality and exceptionalism. And essentially universality is something that you evoke when you want to say, we all do that. Okay,
what you hear in the news
law
today.
Of exceptionalism is the opposite. Where you individualize an action or behavior and say, well, those people are like that. And so moving backwards and forwards or into universality and exceptionalism is a trick of the hand that's very effective in causing a trick of the mind. And so it's important to be able to examine racism, but as Isabel Wilkerson pointed out, you must also be able to look at the caste, the individualized behaviors, the order that is set into motion, assigning people to different strata. Because often everything can be explained through racism, or it occurs concomitantly. It occurs at the same time that the caste system is in place. And so I believe that it's very important to see how integrated these behaviors, these laws and systems are. Racism, it was a tool, and it was able to identify a group of people to maximize the economic theft. But in the process of doing that, there were rules and orders that
laws.
were put into
Yep.
all of the people's systems.
Yep.
And as you pointed out, it's essential that you recognize when I say people's systems, I'm talking about law, I'm talking about economics, I'm talking about education, I'm talking about religion, entertainment, talking about medicine, politics.
Group thing.
All of those systems that comprised and were in collusion to not only maintain racism, but to specifically set a rule order of the caste as well. And so absolutely, that's a very important point, I think, that you bring into the conversation.
And when we hear people say, well, how do we solve these problems? Well, we here at the Umoja Circle, like I said, we always go back in time and bring it forward. Because if you try to deal with the present moment, okay, and people don't realize that the present moment, the word is misinterpreted by many of us. You know, sometimes the media get things wrong, and sometimes they get things wrong deliberately. That's why we created the Umoja Circle, to speak our cultural truth.
Absolutely.
You know, to come from our ways of knowing.
Yes.
Okay, that's the governance structure. I learned this from a great scholar by Dr. Greg Carr out of Howard University. He said there's a social structure, how others look at us, and create this environment like the dominant group had done to justify what they were doing that was horrible. They had to make us look horrible or animalistic and all the things through all those different systems that they have. But there's also the governance structure. How do we look to each other?
Yes.
How do we speak to each other?
Yes.
And we have a way of knowing that is unique to us because of our unique experience. And that is something that we got to understand, that you're not getting educated. That's what Carter G. Woodson talked about, being miseducated.
Yes.
You know, so we have to come, and we come from our governance structure.
Yes.
How we look to each other and how we experience things. That's what makes this show unique to me.
Excellent points, Morgan.
Okay. I see you got some images of
I do.
What he got there. I want to introduce what he got.
Well, we thought we would approach the, Isabel Wilkerson gave us the perspective of how the caste system is set in place. But I think often we miss the intentionality and the devices that are often used, whether it's through the educational system, whether it's built in and written into law. And because we honor, or supposed to honor, the rule of law, we sometimes don't critique how incorrect that legal perspective is.
And we here at the Umoja Circle honor our ancestors.
Yes, we do.
Okay, we try to be the voice of our ancestors and how our ancestors were treated in the reality, not what the mythology states, but the reality from our way of knowing, how we experience.
Absolutely, and I just want to make a comment on when people hear us talk about our ancestors, this is not just an issue of ancestral worship. Our ancestors believed that knowledge and study was essential to the emancipation of the human experience and the human mind.
Yep.
And so we can't advance. And when I say we, I'm talking about African Americans, or use that as a general rule for anybody, as far as that's concerned, without looking at what others established that came before us. So you'll often hear us talk about our ancestors because they recognized that the issuance of study, the issuance of fact, was so essential that we would use later as we progress through this human experience. So getting back to our approach in illuminating some of the things that Isabel Wilkerson so aptly pointed out, was how we have integrated into our system things that we probably never would have even reflected upon as being part of maintaining the caste system. And so stereotypes, false beliefs are essential to maintaining that system of inequality. And for African Americans, blacks, and whatever other title that you want to use, because the one drop blood still applies, there was a set of very specific stereotypes and notions that were assigned to us. And I would like to just depart from our general lecture format and point out some of the devices that were used. Now, what you're seeing here are postcards that were actually sent through the U.S. postal system. So the post office, part of the government, part of the people's system,
the part of the
they sanctioned this.
Yep.
And so they were actually in collusion. Okay, and you people say, well, what did they have to do with it? Well, they allowed it to occur. What you see here is a postcard of a group of young people eating watermelon, and I can't see the inscription because it's. Let me put my glasses on here, but let me just take a moment here and read what the caption says. It says, "Negro Heaven, a watermelon feast in Dixie," and so. This is where you begin to see the stereotypical imagery of blacks and watermelon. There was an opportunity to degrade eating a fruit that I definitely love today, and probably millions of other people around the world. But I just want to show you the humor and the degradation that was projected on the postcard. Something you go into a store and say, hey, let me send this to Aunt Jessie or Mr. Brown.
Don't you think it's
funny? Exceedingly funny, but very harmful to the victim. And, of course, there's a whole series of watermelon issues here. This one here talks about, give me a piece of watermelon, and the young man says, I think that has a, let me see what it says specifically so I don't get it wrong. Give us the rind. And his response is, ain't gonna be no rind. In other words, not only am I not going to give you any, but I'm going to eat the part of the watermelon that people generally discard.
Because we're selfish people.
Until
we're uncouth and all these other stereotypical imagery that justify being controlled by the dominant caste, which is white.
And that's where the analysis comes in, as Smokey pointed out. It's basically, the message is that they're uncouth. Not only do they not share, but the bestiality of their habits are part of this group.
We were also, people don't realize, in New York City, they had a brother from Africa displayed in the zoo, the Bronx Zoo, in the early part of the 1920s. He ended up committing suicide.
Absolutely. And again, these are historical elements that have either been intentionally not addressed.
And we just let you know, we have about less than a minute and a half, but we will continue it on part 4. So this is we'll continue this.
Okay, well, I tell you what I would like to do is wait until the next program to continue our discussion.
Okay, great. We'll start right off with where you left off for the next show. So the comments I'm going to make based on what Brother Derek started and the video also started, and what this book is about, is that there's always been 2 Americas. Okay, let's not forget that. And there's why you see in these videos, we are approached differently at a traffic stop than a white teenager would be approached, or a white, blonde, blue-eyed woman would be approached by the police officers. Because in the caste that is similar to what's in India, we are in the untouchable status.
Yes.
Not the Brahmin, who are the top caste. That was created based on that video. That's how that was established. So we want to make sure that we end you understanding, and we'll continue this topic on the next show. And when we talk about the present and the past, look at the word present, P-R-E-S-E-N-T. If you take that P-R-E and separate it from the S-E-N-T, you got the present moment. The present is always sent to you from you or decision that was made in the past.
Excellent perspective.
That's why we go into the past. And we want you to understand that. This is what we do here at the Emoji Circle, critical thinking. The ancestors taught us that through these books. But as usual, we're running out of time on this segment. So peace, Hotep, bye-bye.